Well, good evening and welcome to the first event in this academic year's Humanities Lecture Series. I'm Victor Bailey, Director of the Hall Centre, which organises the lectures. It's our great pleasure this evening to bring you historian and journalist Rick Perlstein, whose monumental three-volume history, with a fourth volume on its way, documents the rise of the new conservatism in America from the days of Barry Goldwater to those of Ronald Reagan. We're also here to save you from having to listen to the Republican debate. Our guest will take questions after his talk if you would make your way to one of the two microphones. Afterwards, in the big 12 room, I think, opposite this auditorium, there will be a reception where Rick Perlstein will sign copies of The Invisible Bridge and his earlier books, so please join us there. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock in the Hall Centre, Rick will be on hand for a conversation about the historical work that he's done during the past 15 years. These morning events are interactive and enjoyable occasions, and I encourage you to attend. To introduce Rick Perlstein, I've asked David Farber, the very recently appointed Roy A. Roberts Distinguished Professor of Modern American History. I'm pleased we can put David before you so soon after his arrival at, or more strictly, return to KU, since he did a visiting stint here in 1988-89. David is largely Chicago-trained, with MA and PhD from the Windy City. He's taught at a large number of institutions over the years: the University of Hawaii, Barnard College at Columbia University, the University of New Mexico, and Temple University in Philadelphia. His article and book reviews are legion, almost all on America in the 60s, or the politics of race, or social strife and social change in post-war America. He is best known for his editions, The Conservative 60s, 2003, America in the 1970s, 2004, and for his monographs, Chicago, 68, a methodologically path-breaking book, published in 1988, The Age of Great Dreams, America in the 1960s, 1994, now in its 31st paperback printing, and Sloan Rules, Alfred P. Sloan, and the Triumph of General Motors, 2002, now in a 2004 Chinese language edition. However, for tonight's purpose of introducing Rick Perlstein, none of his books is more important than The Rise and Fall of Modern American Conservatism, 2010. I can think of no one more qualified to introduce tonight's speaker. So please welcome Professor David Farber.
Well, we'll all cry crocodile tears that I can't deliver for you tonight, Donald Trump or Ben Carson or even poor Jeb Bush. But I am feeling very lucky that we have tonight instead someone who can think much harder and much better about a whole lot of things that we care desperately about, Rick Perlstein. For those of you who love good writing, for those of you who love to think hard about American politics and the meaning of political culture in the United States, especially for those of you who love good writing about American politics and culture in the United States, we're very lucky to have Rick Perlstein, who is a real treasure in the United States. There's a long tradition in the United States of trying to encapsulate a political culture, an era in our experience. John Dos Passos long ago tried to capture that in the great trilogy USA. In a different generation, Arthur Schlesinger wrote a trilogy called The Age of Roosevelt. And yeah, man, you're the next guy. Carrying on that legacy is Rick Perlstein, who has written an incredible trilogy of books already, with more on the way. He says 4. I think it's going to be about 7 or 8, but that's a gamble we'll have to take. Rick is doing something really interesting and different. For those of us who are academic historians, we like to try to think about structure. We try to think about processes. We try to think about the deep content of political and cultural developments. Rick carries that weight. Those of us who are scholars, academics, those of us who are deep in the archives look at Rick and say, he's one of us. He knows how to do those things. He writes with a strong evidentiary base. He understands the complexity of all the many issues that make up American life. And yet he does something that guys like me aren't so good at. He can paint character. He can paint a scene. He can make a story come alive. He knows how to do the telling anecdote that illuminates, that makes something real again in our lives. This is what historians are supposed to be able to do, to make the past come alive. And Rick makes the past come alive for us, now, in the present. So he's a man who has a political vision and brings to it an artistic temperament and still the tenacity, what we call in German the Sitzfleisch, the ability to sit there and get the evidence that makes his stories not just fascinating and rich, but true and compelling and convincing and cogent. It's really an honor to be able to introduce Rick Perlstein, who's brought to the public imagination the kind of rich, textured views of American life, American politics, American culture, that a generation of academic historians have been trying to piece together. Rick can write that portrait with a telling heart and a piercing intellect. I'm really proud to introduce Rick Perlstein to you.
Well, that introduction is particularly meaningful to me because it was about 20 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago today, let's just say it was, when I met David Farber, and it was in the course of writing an article for a magazine now defunct called Lingua Franca called Who Owns the 60s, about 60s scholarship. And that article, and in a sense that interview with David, really kind of launched me on this vocation of trying to understand the 60s and its meaning for today. So I'm a little verklempt. Who wouldn't be? I really have to bring you some bad news if you came here tonight to escape Donald Trump. You got another thing coming. The speeches that I've been doing the last few years have gotten very formulaic. I would kind of pick 3 or 4 things that were going on in the news that involved Republicans and the conservative movement, and invariably, because the American media is the American media, they would be described as if they'd kind of just emerged out of nowhere the day before yesterday. And I would take the audience back and show how the patterns of thought and action on the right really are quite continuous with what has been happening since the post-war era. I pretty much thought I had it figured out. I would kind of map it against the history I told in my 3 books. This fall, we've been dealt a Trump card. And I find myself in an awkward position. You know how we say, life is what happens when you're making other plans. Well, sometimes history is what happens when you're making other plans. And I find that I cannot explain or understand what's been going on in this very interesting and very exciting presidential campaign season using the paradigms that I've become so familiar with because of my work going back really to that day 20 years ago, in a sense. So I find myself tonight having to kind of walk the plank or the tightrope and try and adduce a different archaeology for what we're understanding. So without further ado, here's what I came up with. It really is an essay, that French word that I think was coined by Montaigne that literally means to try, an attempt. And I will try to attempt what we're seeing this campaign season and the continuities and differences with what we've seen before. Donald Trump is not a fascist. Probably. Ivana Trump once claimed to keeps a volume of Hitler's collected speeches in a cabinet by his bed and reads them from time to time. He responded, "If I had these speeches, and I'm not saying that I do, I would never read them. But remember something the architect of Trump Tower, a man named Dare Scott, once said about how to evaluate the truth value of any Donald Trump claim. Divide by 2, then divide by 4, and you're closer to the answer." He worships force, pronouncing at a rally in August in Derry, New Hampshire, "I believe in the military and military strength more strongly than anyone running by a factor of 1 billion. Following Scott's principle, that means he believes in the military 125 million times more than, say, Lindsey Graham, who announced his campaign by promising to go to war in Iran. When he speaks in the subjunctive mood, he can sound like an aspiring dictator, certainly. Regarding a $2.5 billion plant the Ford Motor Company intends to build in Mexico, he announced that, quote, "Every car, every truck, and every part manufactured in this plant that comes across the border, we're going to charge you a 35% tax." Okay? The Constitution, of course, grants Congress, not the president, the power to tax. Maybe that's just ignorance on his part, or maybe by we, he's referring to the congressional coalition he's building in his spare time between stadium rallies. But if Trump has ever made reference to any active understanding of our 3 co-equal branches of government, I haven't noticed it. He refers lustily to the traitors stabbing America in the back, longing for the days when they received summary execution. So he talked about Bo Bergdahl, quote, "a dirty, rotten traitor," who, by the way, when he deserted, 6 young, beautiful men were killed trying to find him, right? You know, in the old days, bing, bong. And if you've seen the video, you know that's Trump pantomiming the cocking of a rifle. He continued, "When we were strong, we were strong." It's, I suppose, too much to expect procedural niceties from Trump, such as innocent until proven guilty. This is the guy who once took out full-page ads in 4 New York newspapers headed, "Bring back the death penalty, bring back our police," following the arrest of the Central Park joggers. The full-page ads featured a 600-word essay, obviously written by Trump himself. What has happened is the complete breakdown of life as we know it. Criminals must be told that their civil liberties end when an attack on our safety begins. He went on to relate the tale from some mystically perfect past, where he witnessed, quote, 2 young bullies cursing and threatening a very frightened waitress. 2 cops rushed in, lifted up the thugs, and threw them out on the floor, warning them never to cause trouble again. I miss the feeling of security New York's finest once gave the residents of this city. Now, the context, of course, was the arrest of those in the Central Park jogging attack of 5 kids, aged 14 to 16, for the vicious rape and beating of the jogger in Central Park, which had taken place 2 weeks before he placed the ads. The same night as the rape, the young boys were intimidated and coerced into confessions later proven to be false by the same police force Donald Trump insisted had been intimidated into politically correct timorousness. Now, last year, in 2014, when the 5 families settled their more than 10-year-old lawsuit for $41 million for the years their sons spent falsely imprisoned, Donald Trump published an op-ed calling the settlement ridiculous because, quote, the memorable quote, "These men do not exactly have the past of angels." 14-year-old. He's now specified his immigration plan a little more. A forced transfer of population greater than any before attempted in history. Greater than the French and Spanish expulsions of the Jews in 1308 and 1492. The Nabka of approximately 700,000 from British Mandate Palestine. The 1.5 million Stalin consigned to Siberia and the Central Asian republics. Pol Pot's exile of 2.5 million city dwellers to the Cambodian countryside. The scattering of Turkey's Assyrian Christians, which the scholar Mordecai Zakin says numbers in the millions. though that took 180 years, and Trump's promise to move the 12 million Mexicans in under 2 years, quote, so fast your head will spin. And only then he'll start building the wall. But don't all Republican politicians say this sort of thing these days? They all want a wall. They all want to bury criminals beneath the jail. They all raven for war, even if they're not quite so explicit about it. So politically incorrect, right? Not quite, actually. Previous leaders of the Republican Party were sufficiently frightened by the demonic energies of their angry constituencies to not opportunistically feed off the political advantage that came from surrendering to it completely. Think of Barry Goldwater in 1964, who was sufficiently frightened of the racists supporting him that he told Lyndon Johnson he'd drop out of the presidential race if they started making race riots a campaign issue. Think of Ronald Reagan refusing to back a 1978 initiative campaign to fire gay school teachers in California at a time when vigilantes were hunting down gays in the streets. Think of George Bush, who was guiding Congress toward a comprehensive immigration bill akin to that proposed by Barack Obama until the onslaught of vitriol sent Republican congressmen's way by talk radio hosts, forced him to quit, and his constant references to Islam as a religion of peace. Trumpism is different. The first true Republican president or presidential frontrunner to dare this level of demagoguery. But isn't he just giving them what they want? Isn't that perhaps perversely encouraging? As one Trump observer put it in a documentary, I believe Donald Trump would be a very unhappy man if no one paid attention to him. This attention-starved shell, a salesman ideationally hollow at the core, just following the smart money. One friend of mine argues that he'd be perfectly willing to turn on a dime even if his, quote, core issue of immigration, if the political winds thus shifted. Too weak at the core to venture dictatorship because he doesn't have anything he knows he wants to dictate. Well, that's not encouraging, actually. In the event in Derry I referenced above, a telling moment arrived. Trump went into a familiar riff. China is killing us. They've taken so much of our wealth. They've taken our jobs. They've taken our businesses. They've taken our manufacturing, which was when an audience member cried out, our land. Trump paused, pondered, gave it back as a question. Our land? Then, why not, decided to roll with the thought. The way they're going, they'll have that too pretty soon. I think I know the conspiracy theory the perfervid Granite Stater was referring to. I heard it reporting in Orange County about a decade ago that Chinese nationals were buying up residential real estate to make a killing at the expense of the Americans who actually lived there. Trump clearly hadn't heard that one, but surely he will soon, and maybe he'll fold that count into the indictment. Watch for it. The main point, though, was the movement of symbiosis between man and mob. They feed off each other. They eat up Trump's unalloyed joy in bullying, the way, via the little purse of his lips and nod to the side of the stage, he summoned the security guard who ejected Jorge Ramos of Univision, like a casino pit boss with a whale who gets too handy with the cocktail waitresses. Or the not quite veiled threat to Megyn Kelly, I've been very nice to you, although I could probably not be, but I wouldn't do that. He devises ever new ways to bully, and if he's just giving the people what they want, consider what the people want and where our winds are blowing. The Public Religion Research Institute found a majority of whites believe discrimination against whites has become as big a problem as discrimination against blacks and other minorities. A brand new Washington Post ABC poll finds 57% of Republicans support what the Post blandly calls Trump's tough positions on immigration. The pollsters at YouGov.com found that 29% of Americans and 43% of Republicans would, quote, hypothetically support the military stepping in to take control from a civilian government which is beginning to violate the Constitution. which is quite a thing, considering the fact that according to a 2012 Gallup poll, 94% of Republicans consider Obamacare's insurance purchasing mandates as unconstitutional. Not to mention the small technicality that the military taking control of the government for, quote, violating the Constitution is the opposite of the Constitution. Then there is this. Evan Osnos of The New Yorker happened to be reporting on white nationalists, a polite term for what might otherwise be called neo-Nazis, when the Trump phenomenon began. The fortuitous coincidence ended up unfolding as a natural experiment, as Osnos was able to watch in real time as his subjects embraced Trump as one of their own. Usually such figures judge Republicans as Tweedledee to the Democrats' Tweedledum, not Trump. The Daily Stormer neo-Nazi website endorsed him, advising its readers to, quote, vote for the first time in our lives for the one man who actually represents our interests. The leader of a white supremacist think tank told Osnos, I don't think Trump is a white nationalist, although he does reflect an unconscious vision that white people have, that their grandchildren might be a hated minority in their own country. He is the one person who can tap into it. Jared Taylor, editor of American Renaissance, a like-minded publication, observed, I'm sure he would repudiate any association with people like me, but his support comes from people who are more like me than he might like to admit. But Taylor was not quite correct. Asked if he would repudiate legendary Ku Klux Klan leader David Duke's endorsement, Trump's response was less than resounding. Quote, sure I would if that would make you feel better. The F word is largely absented itself from our political discourse. And for good reason. It's become the kind of epithet that stops thought instead of enhancing it. But serious people used to talk about the relevance of the Nazi experience in Germany to American politics all the time. In a typical example from 1964, Philip Rov, a founding editor of the marquee intellectual journal Partisan Review, wrote that the movement that nominated Barry Goldwater for president represented, quote, a recrudescence on American soil of precisely those supranationalistic and right-wing trends that were finally defeated in Europe at the cost of a great war, untold misery, and many millions dead. But within a couple of years, when student protesters were closing down universities through violence and the threat of violence, people like Ronald Reagan said that was exactly what fascists did. So he deployed National Guardsmen with bayonets fixed to keep them open, which student protesters called fascist in turn. By the end of the 1960s, both sides were throwing the F word around with such empty abandon that it became useless. And within decades, the ideology of the journal Rov founded was pretty close to Goldwater's. You can argue, as I would, that neoconservatives were wrong about most everything and a disastrous influence on the country, but to call them fascist would simply serve to reemphasize that signifier's emptiness and insult the memory of those many millions of European dead. Since then, the word has survived via the abject stupidity of the hundreds of thousands of right-wing readers of the worst book ever published, Jonah Goldberg's Liberal Fascism, 2008, which, for example, made much of the fact that both Hitler and a heck of a lot of liberals were, after all, vegetarians. It also survives among a considerably smaller number of only slightly less perfervid liberals. These folks borrow from the scholarship of outstanding historians like Roger Griffin, author of The Nature of Fascism, and Robert Paxton, author of The Anatomy of Fascism, and bastardize it into checklists, the most widely circulated from an obscure political scientist about whom I could find nothing else, named Lawrence Britt. As if a politician who checked off enough boxes like rampant sexism and obsession with national security, and America will suddenly find itself locked into a totalitarian nightmare from which there is no escape except via all-out war. But this all confuses a historically specific description with a usefully predictive model. It treats political development like some biological process. Fascism as something nations, quote, descend into, the natural entropy of failed national institutions. It's a devolution to an older style of political thinking, though a style of thinking that felt perfectly logical in the 1950s and early 1960s among writers for whom the experience of witnessing civilization mysteriously descending into blood-soaked barbarism before their own eyes was but a recent memory. The work that followed was either explicitly or implicitly rooted in a Marxist style of thinking, which is to say, a Hegelian style of thinking. If history was supposed to develop in a certain direction towards socialism or towards liberal democracy, how to account for the fact of a hard right turn that no one had predicted. The process of strong men taking advantage of weak men, with both the strong man, his victims, and their willing executioners produced by the neuroses that attended the breakdown of traditional ways of life, suddenly seemed encoded within modernity itself. And some of this story still rings true. Fascist leaders promised the national rebirth, a merging of a mystically perfect past and a transcendent future from a present fatally compromised by the wickedness of liberalism. Now, niftily, the scholarly term for that, as if nodding to John McCain's 2008 running mate, is paleogenetic ultranationalism. But a lot of political movements do that, including the American Revolution, which, of course, claimed to be restoring some sort of British liberty that existed in the misty past. And history is not a biological process. There's no reason to believe the alienation we see all around us. And if you want to see a really great example, look at a recent Washington Post article called An American Void on the life that was lived by the shooter in South Carolina in a trailer park there. Need to devolve into violent nationalism with its end state. Germany, Italy, Spain, Argentina, and Chile, to cite the major cases, in the particular moments when their strong men arose, suffered weaknesses in their institutions that are just about unimaginable in the United States. For instance, it is hard to imagine a President Trump turning America into a one-party state. Probably a baseline for any kind of true fascism. Which provides us with a delicate analytical problem, because all the same, the post-war thinkers making sense of that experience bequeath useful tools of analysis to us, but ones that are now mostly lost because of the discussion-busting nature of the F word. So, in fact, did popular culture. That ordinary people can become monsters. Everyone who experienced World War II knew that. How did it happen? Any attentive cinema goer or TV watcher in the 1950s would have a decent grasp of an answer. In Ace in the Hole from 1951, a Little seen Billy Wilder masterpiece, the effort to rescue a man trapped in a cave collapsed in New Mexico turns into a lurid carnival as folks flock from miles around, enjoying rides, concerts, and gambling. The party ends when the rescue fails, the man dies, and the revelers slink away in shame at their inhumanity. In The Shelter, a 1961 episode of The Twilight Zone, a convivial suburban neighborhood hears a radio announcement that reveals an impending nuclear attack. Everyone flocks to the town's one fallout shelter, which can only accommodate 3 people, and the seething hostility, resentment, and racism none of them even understood themselves capable of surges to the surface until the announcement is revealed as a false alarm and the threads of trust that bind a community together are revealed as irreversibly vulnerable. There are many more examples. In an interview with NPR's Terry Gross, the director Wes Craven explains what horror films are all about. Quote, fear, certainly one of the most primal emotions. Fear and the necessity for taking action or not surviving. They always sort of perceive what is that subcutaneous, subconscious fear that's in the culture at the time. Post-World War II, a culture coming out of shock at what they had just seen, these horrendous events being perpetrated by the Nazis, in a sense by everybody who went to war against each other. He cited Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, because that is a pure case of not a monster in the sense of Godzilla or something, but a human monster. How did politicians become monsters? That received its cinematic treatments too. In A Face in the Crowd, TV creates a Frankenstein's monster out of an unknown guitar picker. and who's turned into a national sensation via empty promises in an aw-shucks manner, then a group of shadowy millionaires drafts him as their front for their dictatorial political ambitions. Elia Kazan wrote in the preface to his screenplay, "We took cognizance of the new synthetic folksiness that saturated certain programs and the excursion into political waters by these, quote, I don't know anything, but I know what I think, guys." All the King's Men, the 1949 Academy Award winner, based on the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel by Robert Penn Warren, was the classic exposition. It narrated the saga of a country boy based on Huey Long, who begins his political career crusading against justice until the seductions of absolute power and the frustrations of democracy find him surrendering to an abject lust for domination. Warren himself had witnessed Mussolini's rise to power from Rome in the 1930s and spoke of how the alienated nature of life in its slums made their denizens easy pickings for what he called inspired idiots. All the King's Men was philosophically sophisticated, a face in the crowd pretty simple-minded, but they both converge on an insight lost to our own intellectual movement. It's an insight that speaks to the puzzlement animating 1,000 op-eds on the Trump phenomenon. What makes him so popular? Our mid-century American kin would never bother asking the question. The answer was too obvious. All that required was a charismatic figure willing to say anything to animate the masses' darkest hidden prejudices, promising easy answers to apparently intractable problems, promising frenetic action where conventionally constrained politicians, sclerotic bureaucracies, and the messiness of democratic proceduralism promised only gridlock. At least the boss does something, one of the King's Men in Warren's novel excuses the sin of the dictator he works for. Mussolini famously made the trains run on time. All it required was a demagoguery that was fully unleashed, the willing scapegoating of the enemy within as the only reason the masses' desires were frustrated, say by promising to expel 12 million undocumented immigrants so fast your head will spin. Describe what Donald Trump is doing to a mid-century social scientist, and they would respond, of course he is in first place. And I'm fairly certain George W. Bush fully understood he could further expand his own massive grant of post-9/11 power, were he only to escape Muslims as such. It is to his great credit that he did not. He seemed to have understood something our current crop of Republican candidates chasing after what Trump has do not. Something about Pandora's boxes, toothpaste that cannot be put back in tubes, the demiurge. Trump is willing to say anything, Bush was not. Now, someone like George Bush was constrained by a set of commitments Donald Trump is not constrained by. Commitments to transnational corporate capitalism and its ideological handmaiden, neoliberalism. Paul Krugman has recently noted an apparent irony. Donald Trump, the most frightening of the Republican candidates, is also the most sane on economic policy, the most willing to challenge neoliberal orthodoxy. Among the measures he has nodded towards in his vague stream of consciousness non-committal way are raising the taxes of the super rich and single-payer health care. Krugman notes, quote, Mr. Trump, who is self-financing, didn't need to genuflect to the big money, and it turns out that the base doesn't mind his heresies. That is a real revelation, which may have a lasting impact on our politics. David Weigel of the Washington Post has reported about how Trump has built deep support among blue-collar voters in places like Michigan by talking about trade deficits and the losses of American manufacturing jobs, the only Republican candidate to speak about the damage transnational capitalism does to ordinary people. A writer for Vox.com trumpets this as a welcome rift in the red-blue gridlock, suggesting that it means the electorate, quote, is more multidimensional than our partisan narratives tell us. It is interpreted, that is to say, as almost a salutary thing. The Republican frontrunner, if you squint at him in just the right way, even looks a little bit liberal. Our notional mid-century social scientist, or better historically informed pundits, wouldn't be so sanguine. They would recognize the phenomenon labeled in 1967 by the sociologist Pierre Vandenberg as Herrenvolk democracy. That is to say, a political ideology in which members of the dominant ethnic group enjoy privileged provision from the state as a function of the economic and civic disenfranchisement of the scapegoated group, the better to cement authoritarianism. This was Huey Long's promise of a guaranteed income without any practical plan to carry it out. This was how George Wallace governed Alabama. This was apartheid South Africa. And this, more than anything else, is what horrifies the Republican establishment about Donald Trump. Jonathan Chait has observed that the official, i.e. non-Trump Republican Party, has experienced its activist base during the Obama years as an incessant and implacable series of demands for ideological purity. Republicans have dutifully complied with every policy demand. They have refused to increase taxes, even at the cost of programs they support, et cetera, et cetera. It has never been enough. Eric Cantor dutifully towed the party line for his career and even repeatedly sabotaged John Boehner's nascent attempts to strike a fiscal compromise, but then a Tea Party challenger defeated him. Continues Chait, next to the tiny ideological bumps Republicans have obsessively smoothed from their record, Trump's profile of deviations is incomprehensibly vast. He has called himself pro-choice, endorsed single-payer health care, praised Hillary Clinton's performance as Secretary of State, donated to Democrats, and called for a huge one-time tax on existing wealth. It must be galling for the party regulars to prostrate themselves helplessly before the base, purging any hint of independent thought, only to watch a formerly pro-choice, libertine if not liberal, Democratic donor waltz into the lead. Chait chalks that up to Donald's success matching the rageful affect of the Republican base. And of course, that's some of it. But the other part of it is that the economic neoliberalism with which the Republicans serve their donor base and their activists, and which has always motivated conservative leaders most passionately, has also always been an electoral albatross. What became known in the 1970s as the social issues helped paper this over. Back then, according to Gallup, the public favored wage and price controls as the answer to inflation by a margin of 46% to 39%. 85% liked the idea of a public jobs program on the model of the New Deal's Civilian Conservation Corps. Even Ronald Reagan got elected and reelected, not because of his embrace of neoliberalism, but despite it. The statistics are compiled in the perennially useful 1986 study, Right Turn, The Decline of the Democrats and the Future of American Politics, by Thomas Ferguson and Joel Rogers. One poll they cite asked voters in 1980 whether too much was being spent on the environment, health, education, welfare, and urban aid programs. Only 21% thought so, the same percentage as in 1976, 1977, and 1978. The amount saying that the amount spent was either too little or about right was never lower in those years than 72%. The number favoring keeping taxes and services about where they are was the same in 1975 and 1980, about 45%. The pattern continued well into Reagan's presidency. In 1983, the Los Angeles Times found that only 5% of Americans found regulation too strict, while 42% called them not strong enough. Between 1978 and 1982, according to surveys from the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, the number of voters who wished to expand rather than cut back, not just social spending in general, but the dreaded welfare programs, increased in those 4 years by 26%. And finally, in 1984, when Reagan's approval rating was 68%, only 35% favored cuts in social programs to reduce the deficit, which of course was their president's strenuously stated preference. 65% believed such cuts were imminent, and of course that November, well over 60% of them voted for Reagan instead of the Democrat Walter Mondale. As is well understood and has been demonstrated time and time again by empirical social science, one reason white Americans frequently vote against candidates promising such provision they claim to favor is because of their fear it will go to minorities at the expense of themselves. This is the problem Trump's hair-invoked democracy solves, in which downwardly mobile whites can hear themselves being promised the economic protection, safe in the presumption that it won't be shared with scapegoated others. This is a powerful tool for understanding why his popularity with Republican voters grows and grows and grows. Donald Trump is a con man. Maybe. But most definitely his audience comprises pools of juicy marks. I wrote an article about this that got quite some attention a few years ago. I wrote about what happens when you join the mailing lists of conservative publications. You're bombarded with come-ons for things like the 23-cent heart miracle that Washington, the medical industry, and the drug companies refuse to tell you about. You might even receive a come-on like this.
When it comes to great steaks, I've just raised the stakes. The Sharper Image is one of my favorite stores with fantastic products of all kinds. That's why I'm thrilled they agree with me. Trump steaks are the world's greatest steaks, and I mean that in every sense of the word.
Not quite so scary, right? My piece, which appeared in the magazine The Baffler, was entitled The Long Con, and I argued that such hustles were not incidental to conservatism, but central to the movement itself, as a strategic alliance of snake oil vendors and conservative true believers who cooperated in corralling fleeceable multitudes all in one place, and inculcated in them a cast of mind that makes it hard for either them or us to discern where the ideological con ended and the money con began. If you doubt that Donald Trump matches perfectly with this tradition, I recommend the documentary Trump, What's the Deal?, which is available online, but was made in 1980 and never seen then because of lawsuits threats from our litigious friend. It's where I got the quote from his architect, that if you want to know the truth of a Trump claim, you divide by 2 and then 4. I think he's understating things. The lies in this documentary are serial and stunning. You see Donald promising Trump Tower would feature, quote, the most luxurious appointments available because we decided to go absolutely first class all the way, which was why Sophia Loren and the Prince of Wales were buying in. All lies. In fact, an interior decorator explains, in the apartments far beyond the famous pink marble lobby, the base molding is what housing projects use. I've never seen more sloppily installed and more cheaply built kitchen cabinets. The installers, by the way, were illegal Polish immigrants that he never paid, et cetera, et cetera. You see him building literal castles in the sky out of these lies, and of course, since there is no con without a mark, you see people buying the lies, which is what lets the game work in the first place. It's not that his supporters don't know he's a con man. Many revel in it. It's what makes him a winner. As I've written in that article, lying is an initiation into the conservative elite. In this respect, as in so many others, conservatism resembles the multi-level marketing or pyramid schemes that so many conservatives are involved with. In Utah, they say MLM refers to Mormons losing money. The ones at the top reap the reward, and then they preen, pleased with themselves for mastering the game, convinced the con is on everyone else, even if they end up being on the losing end somewhere down the road, which only means you have to lay down more bets. Closing the sale, after all, is mainly a question of riding out the lie, showing that you have the skill and the stones to brazen it out, and the savvy to ratchet up the stakes higher and higher, sneering at or ignoring your earnest, high-minded Mandarin gatekeepers, is just part of the art of the deal, a feature, not a bug. Is that fascism? It's more like professional wrestling, which, of course, as we know, Trump has a long and storied history with. Or maybe it is. Allow me to hem and haw, because that's the historian's prerogative. You know how Trump has that thing where he says he would never say something, and then he says it? That reminds us that he would never say such a thing. Like to Megyn Kelly, I've been very nice to you, although I could probably not be, but I wouldn't do that. I would never compare Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler. It would give him too much credit. But I'll just say that I recently read of a forthcoming book coming from a University of Buffalo historian, Despina Stejakatos, Hitler at Home, on how Hitler's advisors used home life and architecture to manipulate the public, crafting spaces that, like music sets, evoke the right emotions. Then they invited reporters in for tours, where they experienced Hitler in a setting that felt exclusive and emanated warmth. No, but seriously, Statikagos in particular faults the press coverage at the time for not seeing through the hustle. And that's where I think we can make a very close comparison. As a reporter in her book notes, news outlets from home magazines to the New York Times portrayed the Nazi leader as a country gentleman and cultured statesman with a mountain chalet, unaware that the image was propaganda created by an inner circle of experts for political ends. And this is the point I want to conclude with. If you read my writing, you know I'm always taking on the political press. I don't think our political press is any better at providing us the information and analysis to safeguard our liberties now. Again and again, the editorial line has been that Trump's latest supposed gaffe will finish him when they've only preceded greater heights of popularity. Their most recent one occurred only days ago in The New Yorker, where John Cassidy wrote, "In the political world, there's been growing acceptance that Trump can get away with saying things that other candidates can't." Until now, that is. He was referring to Trump's remarks about Carly Fiorina. It doesn't matter. They don't understand that's the feature, not the bug. What matters is the willful refusal to grasp that his appeal doesn't fit the received categories of journalistic analysis, which journalists are unable or unwilling to revise. Political journalism is married to a discourse of consensus, that radicalism is always punished or absorbed into the mainstream. So CNN headlined an article about its new poll, finding that 43% of Republicans believe Barack Obama is a Muslim. This is the headlines. Misperceptions persist about Obama's faith, but aren't so widespread. They reassured us most Republicans think Obama was born in the country. What you're seeing is the center moving to the right, abetted by journalists. They maintain a touching faith that politics can be governed by a simplistic version of Enlightenment rationality in which false claims, once debunked, will simply go away. For instance, in my own hometown of Chicago, the outstanding public radio station WBEZ fact-checked a Trump claim from the New Hampshire event I referenced above. He had said, "We have to build a wall, we have to get the bad people out. A lot of illegals, if you look at Chicago with the gangs, you look at Baltimore, you look at Ferguson, a lot of these gangs, the most vicious are illegals. They're out of here. The first day I will send those people, those guys are out of here." WBEZ fact-checked this with the cities in question. They said, officials in those cities say there's no evidence that this is true, which is like saying officials in the Weimar government say there's no evidence that it is true that Jewish Bolsheviks and Jewish bankers conspired together to stab Germany in the back during World War I. It really is beside the point. The point is we need to revise our categories under the press of historical change. We want to think about Trump using our familiar categories according to familiar norms, judging him by familiar rules. But what Donald Trump is all about, below it all, is incinerating the existing rules, which are being revealed as all too easy to incinerate, like those gossamer norms undone in that Twilight Zone episode. He breaks the system just by his manner of being. And for us writers, it's humbling. With Trump, everything is requiring revision, for me as much as for everyone else. Thank you.
Well, questions, please. The mics are in the two aisles.
Now's the part of the program where I pace.
While someone is getting to one of the mics, may I just ask myself, how then do you, or would you advise the other Republican candidates to combat Trump? They're doing it at this very moment, presumably are trying, but in a way you would, I think, imply there is no way of combating this person, or is there?
Can I say it's above my pay grade? We know how they have been doing it. They've been trying to lower themselves to his level. I mean, we've had this adolescent kind of bitch slap, going on. Bobby Jindal tried to win the news cycle by saying that, Trump's hair looked like a squirrel, or was it a muskrat? I don't know. It's quite a pickle. None of them have managed it, and they all have some very sophisticated people working for them. They've tried, tying him to Hillary Clinton. There's a new attack ad that people suspect was financed by some sort of Republican interest that mocks him for being a cheater at golf. But that just means, it's like that's what it takes, man. It's like a rough world out there, right? And people have called him a cheater before, and he was a cheater before, and he said nothing but success. I don't have an easy answer. I mean, we're all kind of in the same boat, reverting ourselves to the condition of how do you face a demagogue? The problem is, one of the firewalls against demagoguery was strong party structures. Right? You had elites who said you can't do this and could make credible threats, often involving money. But again, Trump is self-financing. You had towering gatekeeping figures. On the right, it was William F. Buckley. Well, William F. Buckley is dead. It's a very difficult problem. I don't know. Maybe Professor Brad here has a explanation.
Well, no, I do not. But what I guess I am curious about is that your 3 books so far of the 8-book arc of the rise of American conservatism kind of tell the story of the growing self-confidence, power, and influence within the Republican Party of those in the 1950s and their descendants who genuinely thought that the New Deal was an un-American and destructive turn, and as of 2005 had come remarkably close, with, say, George W. Bush's plan to try to privatize and thus in a generation eliminate Social Security. And as I read your first 3 books, I see this movement rising from its ashes that had been left during the Great Depression to strength to strength to strength. And yet now you seem to be saying that that movement itself has come to an end, as its principal vehicle, the Republican Party, has been overthrown, overturned, lost control of the electoral and activist base that was supposed to work for it, and been replaced by people who seem to advocate a kind of, call it national Medicareism, that is a love of the social insurance programs created by the New Deal and Great Society insofar as they benefit them, plus an extreme hatred of immigrants that goes very strongly against the establishment Republican love, at least, of skilled immigration as the future of America. Is it indeed the case that you're never going to finish your 8-volume in history because it's been interrupted in the middle, as you were saying earlier, by this populist media wave that has come as a surprise to everyone in the Republican establishment? Or would you say that in 2 years people are going to be writing about how if only Rubio, Bush, Walker, and Kasich had agreed on a single centrist Republican establishment candidate, Trump would never have been a factor, and in the end they managed to scotch him somehow?
Well, I'm not a big fan of predictions. But by the same token, I would say a few things. I won't have to write more volumes because what I will have written will finally have been revealed as history. Right? If Nixon land is over, people kept on saying, as soon as I published this book, Nixon Land, in 2008, which argued that our template for our political struggles today were this red-blue divide, the cosmopolitan elites versus the kind of corporate elites exploiting the silent majority. Well, Barack Obama was elected, therefore Nixon land is over. Well, then the Republicans come back in 2010. But then the Tea Party falls in their face, and Obama's reelected, and people say Nixon land's over. So it was always kind of like Nixon land is over because right-wing populism has received its final defeat. We see this over and over and over again. We see a version of it in the Donald Trump has finally finished himself off rhetoric. But I think if we see a new paradigm, and Trump is successful and isn't just a complete empty suit, then Nixon land will be over in a much more frightening way any of us have experienced. Now, on the question of something like Medicare or Social Security, of course, the way the right wing works is it always folds in reforms that are kind of universally accepted and then moves on to the next frontier of liberty to fight. So, you see in Arthur Schlesinger's The Age of Roosevelt, he has this amazing train of quotes that are just absolutely identical to what they said about Obamacare, that it's going to destroy Western civilization and capitalism will be over, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, George Bush claims to be preserving Social Security. It'll be the same way with Obamacare in 10 or 15 years. I like to say that in 20 years, a Republican president is going to nominate a Supreme Court justice married to someone of the same sex who's going to cast the deciding vote to outlaw the minimum wage, right? I mean, there's always a new frontier of justice to fight. But again, I'm very reluctant to venture any sort of predictions. I think predictions have kind of got us in trouble in the first place. The biggest prediction that we heard was that this year was going to be a boring election season. Right? So that's where I stand with the prediction. This side?
Yeah. I have a question for you about predictions.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I did. I'll have to modify it a bit. But one thing that has given me solace as we've watched the rise of racism in the Obama years was that Obama won, not once but twice. And there seemed to be a demographic argument that racism might still be extremely potent among a minority of the white electorate, but it's unable to create national victories, although the Tea Party has been successful in all kinds of other victories. So I'm wondering what you say to that, kind of the conventional wisdom that says you can't possibly alienate all of America's Latinos and everyone who is sympathetic to them, or 53% of the electorate who are women. There's no way mathematically that you can alienate that many voters and still have a chance at winning. You can rile up people. You can rile up a minority of the white electorate. And that's, I think, what we're seeing Donald Trump doing. But you can't possibly win a national election.
I'll make 2 points, a short-term one and a long-term one. The short-term one is simply that, as many of us now understand, we have two electorates in America. We have the broader electorate that turns out in very high numbers every 4 years and is a cross-section of the American public. And Democrats are the smart money in any presidential election now, including, I think, in 2016. And then we have the off-year electorate that votes in profoundly lower numbers and much more resembles the Republican coalition, older, whiter, angrier. It's just the fact that minorities and lower-income voters just aren't showing up for these elections in the 2018s, the 2014s, the 2010s, and using those and exploiting the advantage they have by controlling state legislatures and gerrymandering, so that in a state like Pennsylvania, which voted by almost 55% for Barack Obama, is represented by 13 Republican congressmen and only 8 Democrats, they control the legislatures. We control. By we, I mean I'm a liberal Democrat. Democrats control the executive. That's a stalemate I think we'll see for at least a generation. In the longer term, I think it's still, and again, I'm thinking in long-term, decades, generational terms, it's still an open question whether Hispanics will turn out to be Italians or Jews. And by that I mean, I first heard this formulation from David Brooks. Jews stayed within the Democratic coalition during the years of the backlash. Italians moved out to the suburbs and largely became Republicans. The fact of the matter is, demography is not destiny for the simple fact that these categories are not secure in any sense of the word. I could show you a book written in 1958 by a Democratic manager named Chester Bowles saying the Republican Party is committing demographic suicide. Democrats are going to win every election because WASPs are declining as a portion of the electorate, and all the white ethnics like Italians and Irish and Eastern Europeans are Union members and Democrats. Of course, these are exactly the people who became Republicans during the backlash. Now, right now, the Republican Party is not doing a very good job of turning Hispanics into Italians. But as more and more kind of enter the middle class, and who's to say that that's not going to happen? History can turn like a battleship. I'm very skeptical of any argument from demographic inevitability. I did a 5-part series on this in The Nation that you can look up about why the demographic confidence argument is politically enervating and intellectually thin. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I really appreciate the fact that in both your writing and in tonight's talk, you've had a lot of emphasis on category. Because,
yeah,
you know, at least from the perspective of politics, it seems that categories, or the way in which you organize your language, which organizes your thinking, really has an immense power in terms of how it directs the kinds of goals we have, directs the kinds of ways we think about our goals, both on the personal level but on a larger social level. And I guess what I want to ask is whether or not you see a shift in categories about politics having to also occur with a shift in language. Does language have to change to shift that category? So you ask, you know, we have to revise our categories, but does that mean we have to revise our basic language regarding how the left and right is organized, our basic language regarding how we achieve truth, how we achieve the good, or asking basic questions like not only what is the political, but asking what is the good or what is the true? Do we need to revise that? And if we do, does that also require us to look and ask more basic philosophic questions in a public arena?
I think that the power of language in politics is obviously crucial and obviously important, but it's overemphasized by liberals these days. George Lakoff was very fashionable for a while, arguing about the power of frames to determine sort of political thought. But a lot of politics is still knocking on doors, looking your neighbor in the eye, earning their trust. A lot of it is raising money. A lot of it is horse trading and favors. And there's really no evidence that, you know, Frank Luntz, you know, created a backlash against the inheritance tax by, you know, calling it the death tax. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. We always have to be revising our categories, right? I mean, as analysts, you know, as political actors, we always have to be present and attentive to the way labels slip the yoke. But I'm afraid that that's secondary to kind of more basic organizing and material concerns to me. Yeah, ma'am.
I'd like to shift and ask you to say a few words about Jimmy Carter. Your description in The Invisible Bridge of him as slippery and not necessarily truthful is startling to those of us who have gotten used to his saintly ex-presidency.
Yes.
I know it's awful to put you on the spot, the man is dying, but would you like to sum up a little?
Sure. Read the book, obviously. There's a lovely article that came out during the campaign season in 1976, early, called The Pathetic Lies of Jimmy Carter. And it was written by a guy named Stephen Brill, who later became still kind of a prominent journalist. And he just nails it. You know, he's like, oh, I reduced the number of departments in Georgia from 60 to 20. He just didn't. I mean, it's just, you know, he did what politicians do. And he also very skillfully frames the 1976 election as a, you know, a referendum on whether whether you wanted an honest, plain-spoken guy or a regular politician. And he successfully put himself forward as a regular politician. You know, if you ever find him in an elevator, ask him about whether he race baited in the 1970, you know, gubernatorial election. He won't answer you because he's never answered you. Does that mean he's a terrible person? No, that means he's a politician. My line about Jimmy Carter, and I did kind of one kind of anticipatory, celebratory essay about him in my current outlet, the Washington Spectator, and I did a radio interview yesterday that's going to run after he dies. You know, I mean, That's what people do. But anyway, I've been emphasizing how the very fact that made him such a poor president politically, and that he just was too arrogant to kind of line up legislative coalitions. You know, he just thought he had the answer, and he was going to present it to the public, and then kind of it was just going to happen. If you look at the actual problems he addressed and the solutions he proposed, they're more prophetic than we even understand, right? I mean, if you look at the first thing he did that was probably just destroyed his standing with Congress politically in 1977, he studied the Army Corps of Engineers reports and all the dams and water projects they were building. And he's like, wow, the Army Corps of Engineers is just a total cesspool of boondoggles and pork barrel spending and environmental waste, and here's a dam that is spending millions of dollars to irrigate one donor's catfish farm. It was just absolutely, like, just from an objective engineer standpoint, indefensible. So he's like, okay, I'm going to cancel 50 dam projects unilaterally without talking about to the congressman whose districts. And it was, everyone watching was like, this is crazy. You don't do this. And, you know, it set him back on his heels, and he had to compromise, and really kind of going into his big legislative fight, which was energy, which of course he was also prophetic, he just was left without any kind of political capital. Well, you know, if you look at the Army Corps of Engineers and the 10th anniversary after Katrina, holy cow, you know, wow, we should have listened to Jimmy Carter, just like we should have listened to him when it comes to those solar panels. But, you know, that's not really how Washington works. I did a recent article about Jimmy Carter, and I'd just written about this in my book. On March 22nd, 1977, he transmitted a message to Congress proposing same-day universal voter registration and getting rid of the Electoral College. The Republican Party, the leaders were like, oh, that's great. It had widespread support. The head of the Republican National Committee, who was kind of like a moderate conservative, said, that's a Republican idea. It really looked like it was going to sail through. And it's a fascinating history that really kind of pretended things to come, because people like Ronald Reagan and publications like Human Events said, well, that'll destroy the Republican Party if more people vote. And Ronald Reagan went on the radio and said we should make it harder for people to vote, because people should really believe in voting in order to do it. And he said we can't get rid of the Electoral College because we're a union of sovereign states. I mean, he really sounded like John C. Calhoun. But if you look back on it, yeah, the idea went nowhere because he had this sort of, well, that's where the honesty comes from, right? I mean, he's kind of like Donald Trump. He just kind of said something and did it, and he didn't really care what the political consequences would be. But man, if we were to listen to him, can you imagine the kind of democracy we have now? So that's Jimmy Carter, you know, a complicated, fascinating figure. You know, I mean, the same with Middle East diplomacy, you know. You don't just get like the president of Egypt and the prime minister of Israel together in a room, lock them together, and say you're not leaving until you come up with a peace deal. Well, he did it, you know. Yeah, maybe, how many more?
Sure. This comes to the last question.
Yeah, last one.
So
Professor.
Would you care to weigh in on the other great political surprise of our season, Senator Sanders and his continuing strong support?
Yes, I have a long piece coming out in Senator Sanders' next print issue of the Washington Spectator, where I'm the national correspondent. I traveled to Dallas, where he gave a rally before 6,000 people, and then went to Houston, where he spoke before a basketball arena full of people. And I think for generations, Lyndon Johnson certainly, the argument has been made if we can just kind of unite sort of ordinary voters behind their economic interests, we can transcend these sort of cultural divisions, right? And it's always been this kind of article of faith. And he's testing it. And he's doing pretty well. My experience in Texas taught me this, and there's much to say, and I recommend the article, that you check out the article, which will come out in a couple of weeks. A huge part of his appeal is among young voters. Dallas is full of fashionable young 20-somethings. The Houston thing was at the University of Houston in their basketball arena, who absolutely go gaga, like they're at a rock concert when Bernie Sanders talks about two things: restructuring college loans, and his idea to make public college and university free like it is in Europe. People are ecstatic about that because debt is kind of like the 500-pound gorilla, that's in every room in America, and no one talks about it because politicians have not given us a way to talk about it, right? Other than futility. I mean, Obama, I think his historians will record his inability to provide meaningful mortgage relief. He chose to foam the runways for the bank famously instead of serving the needs of consumers very harshly, very, very harshly. The fact that Bernie Sanders is speaking to this one issue so forthrightly and so clearly, in addition to all the other stuff, taxing the rich, which always gets 60 to 65% in polls, is very exciting. And when he goes to a place like South Carolina or Liberty University, which he did, no, he's not necessarily going to get, he's not going to win South Carolina necessarily. But what he does is he gets on the front page of newspapers in each of these cities. He gets on the evening news. And people hear that politicians actually can address concerns that matter deeply to them, other than kicking out immigrants. They hear that all the time, other than kicking out immigrants, I said. So I think it's very exciting, and he's a very exciting antidote to the kind of frenetic, media-obsessed. I mean, he's the opposite of Lonesome Rhodes and like a face in the crowd. He refuses to attack his opponent. I've had the unpleasant duty to go into a Senate office as a reporter for the University of Chicago alumni magazine to write a profile of him, which you can also look up. It's about his civil rights activities when he was in college as a sit-in activist in the early 60s, and ask him about what he was like in college. And here I am in the office of Senator Sanders, who's famous for barking at reporters who are frivolous, and I decide I have to ask him if he had a girlfriend in college. Well, he giggled, and more than one is what he said, so. I don't know, it worked out okay. Anyway, it's such a great pleasure to be here, and I'm so grateful to the Hall Center for their sponsorship, and I'm glad to sign books, where that book out there doesn't really have the answers, I'm afraid, but it's still a pretty fun read. Thanks.